Clara Whitfield had learned that a woman could disappear in plain sight if she worked hard enough at it. Marshal Tom Reyes didn't know that yet. He only knew that the coffee at the Larkspur trading post was the best he'd had since Fort Worth, and that he'd been riding for 11 straight days, chasing a rumor that had turned out to be nothing, and that his knees ached in a way that made him feel every one of his 38 years. He eased himself onto a stool at the counter and set his hat on the bar beside him. The trading post was doing a brisk trade this evening, miners down from the Sawtooth claims, a couple of freight haulers arguing over a dice game near the stove, a preacher's family waiting out a storm before continuing on to Bitter Creek. The air smelled of coal oil, wet canvas, and something baking that made his stomach growl before he'd even asked for a menu. "Coffee, and whatever's hot," he said to the boy, wiping down the counter. "Rabbit stew and cornbread," the boy said. "Cook just pulled a fresh batch. That'll do." Reyes had come to Larkspur the way he came to most towns, looking for a man who didn't want to be found. In this case, a horse thief named Dutch Halloway, who'd left a trail of angry ranchers between here and the Wyoming line. He hadn't found Halloway. He'd found instead a town of maybe 200 souls clinging to a rail spur that hadn't quite decided if it was going to grow into something or wither back into the prairie. It was the kind of place a tired man could stop moving in, if he let himself. His eyes drifted, the way a lawman's eyes always drift, cataloging a room without meaning to. That was when he saw her. She moved along the far wall with a coffee pot in one hand and a rag in the other, refilling cups without being asked, wiping spills before men noticed they'd made them. She was young, no more than 22, he guessed, with dark hair pinned up under a plain cap and a face that would have turned heads on any street in Denver, except that she seemed to have made herself small on purpose. She kept her chin down. She moved along the edges of the room, never through its center. When a miner laughed too loud and reached out to catch her sleeve in some clumsy attempt at conversation, she simply turned her wrist a half inch, freed herself, and kept walking, as though she'd practiced the motion 1,000 times, which, Reyes would later understand, she had. No one in that room looked at her twice. That was, he would come to think, the strangest part of the whole evening, that a woman who could have stopped a room with her face alone had made herself into wallpaper, and the room had let her. This was Clara Whitfield, though nobody at the Larkspur trading post called her anything but girl or, on a good day, miss. She had been in Larkspur 2 years, ever since a stagecoach robbery outside Cheyenne had left her father dead in a ditch and her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small tin box of her mother's recipes, water-stained but legible. She had talked her way into a cooking job at the trading post the same week she arrived, because a hungry frontier town does not ask too many questions of a woman who can make a rabbit taste like Sunday dinner. Mr. Higgins, who owned the post, had taken her on because she worked cheap and worked hard and never once complained. He had been right on all 3 counts. In 2 years, Clara had turned the Larkspur kitchen from a source of complaints into the reason half the county rode in on a Friday night, and Higgins had never once raised her wage to match it. She had accepted this the way she accepted most things now, quietly, with her eyes down, because a woman traveling alone in this country learned fast that being noticed was not always a gift. Sometimes it was a target. She had decided, somewhere in the long, grief-soaked weeks after her father's death, that invisibility was a kind of armor, and she had worn it every day since. The boy brought Reyes his stew, and beside it, a wedge of cornbread that steamed when he broke it open. He was hungry enough that he ate without paying much attention, until the second bite, when he stopped chewing entirely. It wasn't cornbread the way he knew cornbread: dry, crumbling, meant to be drowned in gravy so a man could get it down. This had a sweetness to it, and something underneath the sweetness, a hint of wood smoke and molasses, and a crumb so tender it nearly dissolved before he could taste it properly. He ate the rest of the wedge slower, the way a man savors something he suspects he won't get again. He looked up, scanning the room the way he'd scanned it before, except this time looking for someone in particular. "Who made this cornbread?" he asked, pitching his voice to Carrie. The room quieted in that particular way rooms do when a stranger with a badge asks a pointed question. Higgins, wiping a glass behind the bar, went still. A question like that, from a man like that, could mean trouble. And everyone in Larkspur had learned to brace for trouble first and hope for good news second. Clara came around the corner from the back kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and Reyes watched something cross her face that he recognized instantly, because he'd seen it on the faces of men about to be arrested. Not fear, exactly. Bracing. She had heard men ask who made this before, and it had never once been followed by a compliment. "That would be me, sir," she said, and her eyes found the badge on his vest before they found his face. The way a person's eyes go first to the thing that might hurt them. Reyes held up the last piece of cornbread. "Ma'am, I have eaten in every territory between here and the Rio Grande, and this is the finest cornbread that has ever crossed my table." The room did not move. Higgins's glass stopped mid-wipe. A miner near the stove looked up from his cards like he'd misheard, and Clara simply stood there, her hands still twisted in her apron, her expression unreadable, though something flickered behind her eyes that was not quite gratitude and not quite disbelief, but some tangled cousin of both. She had built a wall a long time ago, brick by careful brick, and she had not expected anyone to knock on it, let alone with something kind. She gave a small nod, murmured a thank you so quiet it barely reached him, and disappeared back into the kitchen before anyone could say another word. Reyes finished his cornbread, thinking about that nod for longer than a plate of food had any right to occupy a man's mind. And as he sat there, turning it over, another thought settled on him, uninvited and impossible to shake. In the 20 minutes he'd been sitting at that counter, he had watched her fill a dozen cups, clear 6 plates, and answer 3 different men's complaints, with a patience that bordered on saintly, and not once had he seen her sit down, or eat, or take a moment for herself. The woman who fed the whole room had no place in it. He found Higgins later that night, after most of the crowd had thinned toward the boarding house or their wagons. "I hear you might have rooms," Reyes said. "I'm thinking of staying on a spell. Territories asked me to keep an eye on things out this way. That horse-thieving business isn't finished." Higgins, sensing steady money and the added benefit of a lawman's presence in a town that had lately worried about claim jumpers, agreed readily enough. Reyes took a room above the mercantile next door and told himself it was because Larkspur needed watching, and the horse thief could double back this way yet, and a marshal earned his keep by being where trouble might be, not chasing it after the fact. All of that was true. None of it was the whole truth, and he knew it. In the quiet part of his mind he didn't examine too closely. The reason had a name, and she worked the kitchen at the Larkspur trading post. He fell into a rhythm without quite deciding to. Mornings, he'd ride the perimeter of town and out toward the claims, checking in with the miners, making his presence known. Evenings, more often than he'd admit to anyone, he found himself back at the trading post counter, ordering stew or beans or whatever was hot, and watching. He learned her the way a careful man learns anything slowly, and through small details. He saw the efficient economy of her movements, never a wasted step. He saw how she flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever a man raised his voice, even in laughter, and how she'd recover a half-second later so quickly most wouldn't have caught it at all. He saw the exhaustion she carried in her shoulders by the end of a long night, and the way she'd press the heel of her hand into her lower back when she thought no one was watching. He tried talking to her. It went about as well as he expected from a man who'd spent more years talking to horses and outlaws than to women he admired. "Evening, miss," he'd offer. "Marshal," she'd reply, with a nod so precise it might have been measured with a ruler. "Cornbread's still the best in the territory," he tried once, feeling foolish the moment the words left his mouth. Something flickered amusement, maybe, or simple surprise, that he'd bothered to say it twice. "My mother's recipe," she said. She always said the trick was patience, not flour. And then she was gone, back through the kitchen door, leaving him holding an empty compliment like a man left standing after a dance that never started. He came to understand, over those slow autumn weeks, that Clara was not a woman who trusted words. Words, in her experience, had a way of turning into something else, a compliment into a demand, an interest into a danger. She had learned this on a stagecoach road outside Cheyenne, in ways Reyes could only guess at and never asked her to say aloud. If he wanted her to trust him, he understood. It would not be through anything he said. It would have to be through what he did. His chance came on a rainy evening in late October. He'd stayed later than usual and watched her wrestling with the storeroom door, whose hinge had rusted and dropped so that the door dragged and stuck and had to be hauled open with both hands and a grunt of effort each time. She said nothing about it. She simply fought it open, went in for supplies, and fought it shut again, over and over, all evening. The next afternoon, Reyes spent an hour in the town's small forge with the blacksmith, learning enough to true the hinge himself, filing and fitting until the metal sat right. That evening, he waited until the storeroom was empty, slipped in with his tools, and fixed it, not a word to anyone, in and out, before Higgins even noticed he'd left his stool. Clara found it that night. She put her hand to the door the way she always did, braced for the familiar drag and shriek, and instead it swung smooth and silent on its hinge. She stood there a moment, staring at it, and then her eyes swept the room a quick, searching glance until they landed on Reyes, who was very carefully studying his coffee cup and not looking back at her. She said nothing. But when she carried the flour sacks back to the kitchen, her steps seemed lighter, and Reyes allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something close to hope. From that night on, their conversation took a different shape, a language spoken entirely in small, deliberate acts. He noticed the woodpile behind the kitchen was low and getting soaked in the rain, and the next morning a cord of dry, split pine appeared, stacked neat beneath the eave, with no note and no name attached. He mentioned to Higgins, offhand, that the well pump squealed something terrible, and within the week it had been oiled and quieted. She began, slowly, to answer in kind. His stew arrived with an extra piece of meat, unasked. His coffee came hotter, stronger, exactly the way he liked it, though he'd never once told her how he liked it. She had simply noticed, the way he'd noticed her, small things, foolish, trivial things, that in the careful, guarded world they were building together felt as weighty as any spoken vow. The other men in town started to notice, the way men in small towns always do. "You've taken quite a shine to Higgins's cornbread, Marshal," said Sheriff Doyle Caro, the town's aging constable, one afternoon as they sat together outside the jailhouse, watching the street. He said it with a grin that told Reyes he wasn't fooling anybody. Reyes grunted and said nothing. "Funny thing about a man who rides in from checking claims and always finds himself hungry right around supper time at the trading post," Caro went on, chewing on the end of a matchstick. "And never anywhere else in town." He looked sideways at Reyes. "That cook, is it? The quiet one?" "Don't know what you mean," Reyes said, feeling his collar grow warm despite the October chill. "You've got a truly remarkable talent for not seeing what's directly under your nose, son," Caro said, not unkindly. "But you'll get there eventually. Some men just need a longer trail than others." The old sheriff's words followed Reyes home that night and sat with him uneasily, echoing a question that had been building in the back of his mind for weeks now. What exactly was he doing, riding circles around a town, inventing reasons to sit at one counter, fixing hinges in the dark like some kind of ghost, for a woman who barely spoke 10 words to him in a week? It was a fool's use of a man's time, and yet the thought of stopping, of not riding back to Larkspur in the evenings, left something hollow and aching in his chest that no amount of practical reasoning could talk him out of. The turn came on a night in early November, cold enough that ice had begun to skin over the water troughs. The trading post was quieter than usual, most of the miners having ridden out to a claim dispute further up the canyon. Reyes sat near the stove with his coffee, and the kitchen door had been left slightly open behind the counter. He could hear voices, Higgins's, low and businesslike, and Clara's, so soft it was almost lost beneath the crackle of the fire. "Winter's slow season, girl," Higgins was saying. "Can't keep paying you the same when half the tables sit empty most nights." Reyes went still. I'll need to trim your wage some, Higgins continued, as though he were reading off a supply list rather than deciding a person's fate. And you'll take on the mercantile's laundry too, since Higgins's wife has her hands full with the new baby. No sense you standing idle of a morning. There was a long pause. Reyes could picture her exactly, her hands twisted into her apron, her face gone carefully blank, the particular stillness of a person absorbing one more unfairness onto a pile she'd stopped bothering to count. He felt something cold and furious begin to build low in his chest. She had built this kitchen's reputation with her bare hands, fed this whole miserable town through 2 winters, and this was what she got for it. Less pay, more work, no word of thanks. When her answer finally came, it was 2 words, and they landed on Reyes harder than any gunshot he'd heard in his years wearing a badge. Yes, sir. He stood up so fast his chair scraped loud against the floorboards. He left coins on the counter he hadn't bothered to count, and walked out into the cold without looking back, the unfairness of it burning through him like bad liquor. He rode out to the edge of town and sat his horse there a long while, the frigid wind doing nothing to cool the anger sitting in his gut. He did not sleep that night. He lay awake, turning over Caro's words. Some men just need a longer trail than others, and understood, with a clarity that shamed him, that he had been exactly that kind of slow. He had spent 2 months watching her the way a man watches weather move across the plains, admiring it from a safe distance, forgetting that the woman he was admiring could be worn down, piece by piece, by people who would never once think to ask if she was tired. By the time gray light crept over the ridge the next morning, he had made up his mind. He waited that evening until he knew she'd be carrying the wash water out back, the way she did every night after the supper crowd cleared. He stood near the corner of the building, out of the wind, his heart going harder than it had any right to for a man who'd faced down armed outlaws without so much as a raised pulse. The back door opened and she came out with a heavy basin, her head bowed against the cold, and didn't see him until he spoke. Clara. She stopped, her head snapping up, eyes wide in the low light. He had never once said her given name aloud to her before, and he watched it land on her like something unfamiliar and startling. He stepped closer, boots crunching in the frost. I heard Higgins last night, he said, keeping his voice low and steady. What he's doing to you, it isn't right. She looked away, down at the basin, a curtain falling over her face the way it always did when she didn't want to be seen wanting anything. It's the way things are for a woman on her own, she said, quiet, more fact than complaint. It doesn't have to be, he said, closing the last of the distance between them. His next words came out clumsier than he'd have liked, but he pushed them out anyway. The territory's granting me a post out past the Sawtooth claims my own station, to keep the peace out that way through the winter and beyond. There's a house that comes with it. Needs work, but it's sound. I've already started on the roof. He paused, watching confusion flicker across her face. There's a proper kitchen, Clara. Yours to run. Your own stove. Your own supplies. Nobody standing over you telling you how much bread to bake or what to charge for it. It was not a declaration of love, not in so many words. It was an offer of work, of a wage that was fair, of 4 walls where no one would ever again make her feel smaller than she was. But it was the only language he trusted himself to speak plainly, and he meant every word of it more than he had meant almost anything in his life. Clara stared at him, the basin nearly forgotten in her hands, the cold wind pulling a strand of hair loose across her face. She was looking at him now the way she had never let herself look at anyone in 2 years, not as a badge, not as a customer, not as a danger to be managed, but as a man who had spent 2 months proving himself in silence. It was a frightening thing, she knew, to trust an offer like that. Her whole life since Cheyenne had taught her that trust was a door that opened onto loss. She looked down at her hands a long moment, the world seeming to hold still around her. When she spoke, her voice was barely above the wind. I have my mother's recipes, in a tin box. It's all I kept when I left everything else behind. It was not a yes, it was not a no. It was the truest thing she owned, laid out plainly between them, the sum of everything she had left in the world. Reyes understood exactly what she was asking, and exactly what it would mean to promise it. "Bring the box," he said, his voice thick. "There's a shelf built right into the kitchen wall. By the stove. It'll have a home there. And so will you." A single tear tracked down her wind-chapped cheek, though her chin stayed level and her eyes stayed dry of anything but that one betrayal of feeling. She looked up at him. "When would you want me to start?" He nearly laughed with the relief of it. Instead, he let himself smile, a real one, the first in longer than he could remember. "I'll bring the wagon around tomorrow morning." He came as promised, at first light. Her belongings fit into a single trunk, 2 spare dresses, a small Bible with a cracked spine, a sewing kit, and the tin box of recipes, which she carried on her own lap the whole ride out, like something that might break if jostled. When Higgins came out to protest the sudden loss of his best cook, Reyes gave him one long, flat look that promised more trouble than the man wanted any part of, and Higgins found other things to occupy himself with instead. The ride out to the Sawtooth station took the better part of the morning, the land opening wide and rust-colored under a pale winter sun, mountains standing up sharp and blue in the distance. The house, when they reached it, was small but sound, exactly as he'd described: a new roof, a good stove already blacked and ready, a stack of split pine piled high on the little porch that he'd cut and set there without being asked. She ran her hand along the worn wood of the kitchen table, then turned to him, the tin box still cradled against her chest. "The shelf," she said. He showed her. A sturdy little shelf, built into the wall right beside the stove, the warmest corner in the house. She set the box there with something like reverence, and stepped back to look at it, the first thing that had ever been entirely, only hers. Life at the station was a different world from Larkspur. Clara's kitchen became her own small kingdom, feeding the handful of deputies and travelers who passed through under Reyes's watch. They were a different breed than the trading post crowd, grateful, direct, unashamed to say when something was good. "Finest biscuits I've had west of the Mississippi, ma'am," one young deputy told her within her first week, echoing, without knowing it, the very words that had first cracked open the wall she'd built around herself. She began to change, slowly. The tight worry that had lived permanently between her brows started to ease. She still didn't smile easily, but the deep weariness that had sat behind her eyes for 2 years began, bit by bit, to lift, replaced by something calmer. She started sitting down to eat her own meals at the long table, rather than standing at the stove until everyone else had finished. She sat, more often than not, near Reyes. Their courtship continued in the same quiet language it had always spoken, now filled in with small, ordinary conversations about the practical business of a shared life. He'd come by her kitchen in the evenings, ostensibly to talk over supply orders, and end up staying to peel potatoes while she talked. She noticed a tear in his coat sleeve one week and mended it so neatly the seam nearly vanished. They began, slowly, to talk about things that mattered. He told her about a dream he'd carried a long time, of land of his own someday, with good grazing and a view of the mountains. She told him, for the first time to anyone, about her mother, about the way she used to hum while she kneaded bread dough, and how that tin recipe box was the last living piece of her that remained in the world. One evening, 2 deputies fell into a loud, friendly argument over a hand of cards, and Reyes glanced over at Clara. "Reminds me of Larkspur," he said. A small smile touched her mouth. "It's not the same," she said. "The noise here is different." "How's that?" "Here," she said, watching the men laugh. "It sounds like family teasing each other. There, it just sounded like men who were tired and angry and had nowhere else to put it." He understood exactly what she meant, and something in his chest settled at hearing her say it. Winter thawed, slowly, into a muddy, green spring. The frost melted off the ridgelines, and the first wild flowers came up along the fence line. Whatever Reyes had kept carefully banked all winter now burned steady and impossible to ignore any longer. He knew, at last, what he had to do, knew he'd been slow getting there, same as Caro had warned him, but he'd gotten there all the same. He found her one evening sitting on the porch step, watching the last color drain out of the sky over the mountains. He sat below her on the step, quiet a long while before he spoke, and the silence between them no longer felt uncertain the way it once had. It felt like something settled and sure. "House is sound," he said finally. "But it's built for one person, mostly. Feels small some nights, with just me rattling around in it." She said nothing, only kept watching the darkening sky. He cleared his throat, working for the words. "What I'm saying, Clara, badly, I know it is that I'd like it to be built for two. I'd like you to stay on, not as my cook, as my wife, if you'll have me." She turned and looked down at him, the last of the light catching in her eyes. A long, still moment passed between them, the whole evening seeming to hold its breath. Then a slow smile broke across her face, warm and unguarded in a way he had never once seen it before, and it near stopped his heart entirely. "You got there, Tom," she said, soft, laced with gentle humor. "Took you long enough about it." She reached down and put her hand over his. "Yes, obviously, yes." Their wedding was small and plain, held on a bright morning in May under a sky scrubbed clean by spring rain. The deputies stood as witnesses, scrubbed and combed for the occasion, and Sheriff Caro rode all the way out from Larkspur just to stand beside Reyes, grinning like he'd won a bet with himself. Clara wore a dress, the pale blue of a spring morning, sewn by her own hand from cloth Reyes had brought back from town without telling her what it was for. She carried no flowers. Her hands stayed empty, ready for his. When the circuit preacher pronounced them married, Reyes didn't kiss her in front of the gathered crowd. He simply took her hand in both of his and held it, and it felt, he would say later, like the first time in years he'd stopped moving and simply arrived somewhere. 6 years on, the porch had grown wider, added on to twice as the family had grown into it. The house behind it stood solid, built up piece by piece from that first small station house, on land that was now entirely their own. The evening sun laid gold and purple light across the mountains beyond the fence line. Reyes sat in a rocking chair he'd built himself, boots up on the rail, watching a boy of 5 with his mother's dark hair and his father's steady eyes stack river stones into careful, wobbling towers on the porch steps. Inside, in a cradle Reyes had carved that winter, a baby girl named Grace slept soundly. It had been 6 good years. They had built something from raw ground, not just a house, but a whole small life, quiet and hard-won and entirely their own. Clara set her mending aside and went inside, coming back a moment later with 2 mugs of coffee and a small plate of biscuits, the same recipe from that worn tin box, now nearly memorized by heart. She handed him a mug and set the plate between them. He broke one open, steam rising with that same faint sweetness he remembered from a rainy autumn evening years before, and took a bite, chewing slow, savoring it the way a man savors something he never expected to have twice, let alone for the rest of his life. "Still the best thing I've ever put in my mouth," he said, quiet, and meant it exactly as much as he had the very first time he'd said it. She looked at him with an expression that needed no further words behind it, a look built over years of small kindnesses, of hinges quietly fixed, and firewood quietly stacked, and biscuits quietly shared, long before either of them had known how to say what they meant out loud. She reached over and brushed a crumb from the corner of his mouth. "Silas takes after you," she said, nodding toward their son's stubborn tower of stones. "Won't quit till it's standing just right. And he's got your patience for it," Reyes said. "He'd stay out there till the stars came up if we let him." He took her hand, their fingers fitting together the way they had for 6 years now, easy and familiar, and they sat together in the deepening evening, watching their son build his careful little tower as the first stars came out over the mountains, because that, in the end, is what it means to truly see someone. It rarely announces itself with grand speeches or bold declarations. Sometimes it is nothing louder than a man quietly fixing a broken hinge in the dark, asking for no thanks and expecting none. Sometimes it is nothing more than a woman setting an extra biscuit on a plate for the one person who finally noticed her. It is the plain, patient work of paying attention, of recognizing worth in someone the rest of the world walked past without a second glance. It is understanding, in the end, that what a person is worth was never in how loudly they spoke, but in the quiet steadiness of their hands and the strength it takes to keep going when no one is watching. And love, the truest kind there is so often nothing more than a long, unhurried, unfolding, a slow and certain waking up to the truth that the very thing you'd been searching for had been standing right in front of you the whole time. Sometimes the people quietly holding a room together are the ones we least think to thank. A hinge fixed in silence, a warmer cup of coffee, a shelf built for someone else's treasure, these small, patient acts can matter more than any grand words ever could. Real love rarely announces itself. It simply shows up, again and again, until someone finally feels seen. A small note for you. This story was imagined and written with the help of AI, meant purely to bring you a warm, entertaining moment while carrying a small, positive lesson along the way.